Ladies and gentlemen, we have what I think is going to be a really interesting panel for the next hour and a half, talking about Australia and Indonesia getting back on track. I think there would be a general consensus, I hope, in this room, if perhaps not in the wider country, about the importance of trying to bring our bilateral relationship to a better place. And we have five speakers who are really incredibly well placed to offer us their insights about how we might achieve that. Then we're going to move to some Q&A with time for some discussion and questions and observations from the floor before we finish. Now, each of our speakers knows that they've been requested to speak for approximately 7 or 8 minutes. I intend to be a reasonably rigorous timekeeper because I have no doubt that each of them could add 70 or 80 minutes worth of value add, but we don't have time for that, and I want to make sure that we do leave some time for discussion at the end of the session. I'm also not going to spend too much time introducing our speakers in terms of mentioning their backgrounds to you. I think they will be, many of them will be well known to many of you. So panellists, please don't take it as disrespectful if I move very quickly through what are stellar careers and in the past and the present and the future. Bill Farmer is going to be our first speaker, former ambassador to Indonesia, former secretary of the Department of Immigration. Allan Behm, an old friend of mine from Department of Defence, was FAS IP, First Assistant Secretary, International Policy Division in Defence. More recently was Chief of Staff to Greg Combe for a number of years. Allan, I'll give you a free plug. Allan is about to release a Melbourne University Press book reflecting on his time in Mr. Combe's office, known as No Minister. That was a phrase I used to use quite often when I was working for Alexander Downer as the Shadow Defence spokesman many years ago. The conversation would be something like, Peter, can you lend me $50? No Minister. And but Allan, we look forward to your comments. Greg Fealy, Associate Professor from the Bell School of International Relations at the ANU. Graeme Dobell, one of our most serious and respected international affairs journalists, now the ASPI Journalism Fellow, and Natalie Sambhi, who is going to be our final speaker, our very own senior editor on the Strategist blog and specialist on all things Indonesian. Now, colleagues, you have notionally 10 minutes. You would oblige me enormously if you can be disciplined in your observations about Australia and Indonesia getting back on track and overachieve by under-delivering and keeping to something like a 7 or 8 minute period. Bill, I'm happy to cede the ground to you here, or if you wish to go over there. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Hello, everyone. Yeah, look, discipline I totally agree with, and I wish we'd had a bit more of it in recent months. I think certainly to get back on track, what we need to do, I think, is to regain perspective. And certainly in my view, that's been lost in recent months over the Bali 9 duo, as exemplified in the decision for the first time ever to recall our ambassador from Jakarta. And I just have to ask myself, was this a bigger issue than Konfrontasi when we had our soldiers killing each other? Was it a bigger issue than the Bellabo massacre of Australian journalists? Profound disagreements over East Timor, confrontation over boat people and refugees, the jeopardising of the live cattle export trade, which, by the way, happens to sustain 10,000 families in Northern Australia, or the crisis over spying allegations. Well, I don't think so. Australia, I think, allowed this issue to get out of hand. We started well. We made high-level representations at a level and at a frequency that were really quite apposite. The sorts of things that the government should do and would have been justified in saying we've done our lot. But these were egged on by, I guess, Vox Pop and also a variety of other things. We really beat it up. We pulled out the microphone. we came up with proposals which never stood the slightest chance of being implemented. Keep them alive and we'll pay for their keep forever. Keep them alive and we'll repatriate some Indonesian crims from Australia. Keep them alive or you'll be guilty of hypocrisy. Now, we stirred up feelings in Indonesia, which took to grandstanding on its own part. Witness that the move of Chan and Sukumaran from Bali to prison. I think that was their way of saying, good, we've got your message, now here's ours. And I think that after the execution, we withdrew the ambassador, we declared our anger, we called it a dark moment. Well, frankly, it's not the first time that our countries have got into this sort of standoff. We had it over Timor, over Papua asylum seekers, illegal fishing, boat turnbacks, spying allegations, animal exports, and we've found ways to move on, and that's what we need to do now. And I think it is a good thing that Julie Bishop was reported on Friday as saying that it is time to move on. Now, what should that moving on entail? In my view, first of all, we've got to focus on our national interest. Forget about the ego and forget about relationship. Just focus on what it is that we have at stake in this relationship. And remembering also that nothing we do now will bring back Chan and Sukumaran. This is not like other issues, cattle, boats, refugees, what have you. The issue is to some extent over. The second thing is that I think our ambassador should return soon. There's no point in his hanging around some sort of prolonged absence. That only throws up the need for some sort of rationalisation, highly contrived to say sooner or later, months later, now we conclude he goes back. In the next few days, weeks or what have you, we can say he was withdrawn for consultations, we've had them, and he's now going back to continue what the ambassador should be doing, which is pursuing our interests in Indonesia. Third, we shouldn't become hyperactive in trying to put things right. The best thing is to keep out of Indonesia's face for a while and avoid activity for activity's sake. Now, Sambhi said, politicians love activity, it's their substitute for achievement. Well, I think from time to time, what we need to do is take that into account and just get on with the job. We don't need goodwill missions. We don't need a high-level visit of this. We need to let things calm down for a while. Fourth, I think we should aim for a low-key continuation of necessary and worthwhile ongoing activities. Things like police, defence, all of that stuff, both government and non-government, and look to resumption of some other things which have fallen aside for the time being. Andrew Robb for example, was to have led a trade mission to Indonesia, the biggest ever, blah, 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 in March. That didn't take place, and we should be looking to renew that sometime a bit later in the year. If Barnaby Joyce, I never thought I'd agree with things that Barnaby said, but the other day when he said, what about he was asked, what about the ban or the suspension of ministerial visits? He said, well, I don't know about any suspension. If I need to go, I'm going to go. Well, good on you, Barnaby. I think that's really common sense stuff. And I think that we should, without any sense of urgency, we just should calm down. We should think about when it might be propitious to pursue further senior level government-to-government encounters. In other words, common sense, low-key, unhurried, calm, national interest-based. And the tone of comments coming from Jakarta in recent days, for example, on the aid announcement on budget night, seemed to me to be actually pretty common sense and low-key. They're certainly encouraging and consistent with the sort of approach that I've talked about. But at the same time, I'd like to sound a note of caution. I don't think we can or will anytime soon return to what 5 years ago seemed to be like the evolution of an increasingly natural partnership with Indonesia. Sort of thing exemplified by our joint work on counter-terrorism, our joint sponsorship of regional initiatives on things like sustainable fisheries, disaster management, and counter-terrorism, agreements on yearly meetings of senior leaders, that sort of partnership work. I think that's partly because SPY is gone, and we do not have in Jokowi a president who's so disposed to making allowances for our sensitivities and priorities, or in general, so instinctively well disposed to cooperation with the West in general and Australia in particular. And it's partly because both Australian and Indonesian election campaigns included elements of bilateral fractiousness, because vociferous public opinion in both countries contains some stridently negative elements, and because it'll take a while for the rawness of comments from both sides in recent months to heal. Having said that, I return to my first point: is we shouldn't get too excited about this. We should face up to the fact that we have very solid interests and a very solid base for working with Indonesia. Neither country seems to me to have an interest in putting more fuel on the fire in relation to the recent executions. Certainly, I can't see what we might hope to achieve by prolonging a standoff. We do have many elements which work in ways conducive to our long-term interest in Indonesia, in areas as diverse as security cooperation, Asian regional arrangements, school twinning programs, the reverse Colombo plan. We should get on with these, develop them where we can, and when it's in our interest to do so. Thank you, Peter.
Commendably brisk start. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. Allan, I'll go to you next on the batting order.
Good evening, everybody. I'll do my best not to repeat anything that Bill Farmer just said. I agreed with every word he said. Just an excellent presentation. I think you summed it up very, very crisply. So congratulations.
And I agree with you.
You may not. I hold the Australian diplomatic service in very high regard. We have extraordinarily competent diplomats. But as a nation, we are awful diplomats. And that is a fair bit of our problem. And the reason for this is that most of our international relationships are conducted at the tactical level. As we in defence, we make big distinctions between the strategic level of activity and the tactical level. The tactical level is easy, it's straightforward, and it's always transactional. The strategic level is transformational, and we almost never conduct our international relationships at that level, and we certainly have never conducted them with Indonesia at that level. The relationship tends, in fact, to be driven by the vagaries of events, incidents and issues rather than the pursuit of common interests or common goals. We don't talk about those. We certainly don't talk about values. There are three features that characterise Australia's approach to Indonesia, in my opinion, and this morning I got back and had a look at Rati Harjono's very insightful book from back at the beginning of the 90s, I think. Suku Putihnya Asia, Perjalanan Australia Mencari Jati Dirinya, Australia's journey to find its self-identity, white tribe of Asia. And it's quite confronting. So just let me make a little sort of summary of that. In Australia, we have a very strong sense of Indonesia's otherness. It's different. They look different. They don't speak English, and we certainly don't speak Bahasa. We display very little sensitivity to the cultural dynamics of Indonesia. And I think that was very clearly on display by both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. The Foreign Minister said that she got angry with her counterpart, and she made that comment to the media. And the Prime Minister was playing a kind of sort of boxing match with Jokowi, where it was transactional and zero-sum game. Jokowi had nowhere to go, and certainly the Prime Minister didn't devise somewhere for him to go. Australia sees everything in black and white, and the Indonesians, of course, see everything in shades of grey, and many, many more than 50, let me tell you. Yeah. And as Bill said, the megaphone is our default position. There are four features, I think, that characterise Indonesia's approach to Australia. I think there's a very clear uncertainty and self-doubt in the Indonesian character, not at the personal level, but at the national level. I think that there's a tendency to national introspection in Indonesia. They're not brash like we are. And that leads to a measure of diffidence in the way in which Indonesia conducts its own international relationships. There are widespread suspicions about our motives, Australia's motives, and the consequent emergence of vocal and xenophobic nationalism in Indonesia is, to me, very striking. I'm a person who looks at the Indonesian language newspapers, not every day, but most days of the week, and it's very, very clear in the Indonesian language newspapers, not nearly so clear in the Jakarta Post. And of course, Australians are bule. And if you're in the United States and somebody calls you a honky, you probably don't like it very much. So most of us who, to Indonesians, look like albinos, we don't much like being called bule. But it's part of the discourse. And certainly, whenever I've travelled around Jakarta in recent years, everybody screams out, "Hey, bule! Hey, bule!" And it's not meant to be flattering. I don't mind it, actually. I think it's amusing. Amongst the Jakarta elite, the knockdown nature of Australian politics is just another symptom of the fact that Australian politicians are what the Indonesians describe as kurang ajar. That means that they're boorish and with very little appreciation for subtlety. The word halus, which is a very halus word, which means refined, is not a word you ever hear Indonesians say about Australia or the way in which we conduct our relationships with them. The core problem is, in the bilateral relationship, in my view, is the lack of trust. And generally speaking, governments are not good at building trust because, as I said earlier, the actions are transactional rather than transformational. But when we were working on the defence relationship, the focal point of what we were trying to do with the Indonesian armed forces was not to make friends, not to become friends, but it was to build trust. And to a measure, we succeeded in doing that. We certainly would not have been able to gain Indonesia's agreement to the UN-mandated Interfed in 1999 had it not been for the trust that we were able to generate, both between Wiranto and our CDF and cascading down their structure. It was trust. And sometimes we're sort of a bit friendly. It's very hard to build trust, and I'd just like to offer a couple of observations how we might think about doing it at the government-to-government level as we go forward. The best way to do it, in my view, is to work with Indonesia to strengthen their institutions. I think we ignore the fabulous strength of our own institutions, and we don't see that the stronger that the national institutions of Indonesia are, and I mean particularly the legal institutions, law enforcement, economic institutions and so on, the better it is for us. If I were to set a KPI for Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, it would be this. We should work with Indonesia to lift its corruption perception index from 107th in the world, which is where it is in the 2014 Transparency International list, to say 50th, which would make it equivalent with Malaysia. And in case you've got any hubris around, Australia ranks 11th on that list internationally after New Zealand and Singapore. But still, it would be a good goal to work to get Indonesia to be a much more open, transparent society, less corruption, stronger institutions. The final comment I have is that we do need also to broaden our concept of security in the way in which we think and talk to Indonesia. We do tend, and I mean I'm from a defence background, so we tend to think of it in sort of the colours of khaki and dark blue and light blue. We see it in sort of very military terms. But human security and social security are very, very important aspects of national security, as indeed is economic security. So we do need to sort of think a bit more broadly in the way in which we think of Indonesia's security infrastructure. And if there is one area that I would really focus on, it happens to be climate change. Not because I've worked on climate change policy, which is now sort of been remaindered, I think is the word for publishers, but it is an area where the physics of climate change have an absolutely devastating effect on Indonesia. Rising sea levels, increasing salinity, increasing ocean acidification, these are things which our universities and their universities, our agronomists and theirs, really need to work on, where the investments would be actually quite low cost, and yet the returns would be fantastic. So that would just be an example of the sorts of things where we could lend a measure of hope and optimism as we build a much more broadly based security relationship over the years to come. Thank you all very much.
So the title of this session is Getting Back on Track. And what does it mean to be back on track? I think it's wrong to assume that the tracks that we're going to be getting back on are heading in the same direction as they were previously. I think we have to acknowledge that there's the rapidly changing nature of the relationship between Indonesia and Australia, and that we need to rethink our approach to it. And most of these changes are taking place on the Indonesian side, not so much in Australia. The broad parameters of these changes are fairly well known, and I'm only going to refer to them just briefly. And there are a number of interlinked factors, so I've got 3 factors listed here. The first is that Indonesia is growing far more quickly, economically, than is Australia. By some measures, it's already a top 10 nation in the world, particularly if we look at, purchasing power. And of course, many of you will have seen the predictions of major multilateral agencies, merchant banks and the like, which have Indonesia variously rising to the top 5, the top 4, or what have you in the next few decades. And indeed, Indonesia has some of the most favourable demographics in the world to fuel this growth. So Indonesia has come to see itself as being, quite rightly I think, as being on the cusp of becoming a major power in the world by dint of the size of its economy and also its population, with the addition of its strategic position. And this has had an inflating effect on much of the political leadership in Indonesia, a surge of self-importance. And so Indonesian leaders are thinking much more in global terms now than they did in the past, where they previously thought mainly in regional terms, and they're increasingly looking northwards rather than southwards. The second point, and concomitant with the first, is rising nationalism. This has been emerging over the past few years. It's always been near to the surface, as Allan has been talking about, but we saw the full efflorescence of this in last year's presidential election, where there is some of the most common tropes were about sovereignty and dignity and national assertion. Both Jokowi and particularly Prabowo spoke a great deal about the predations of particularly Western powers upon Indonesia, about the amount of wealth that have been ripped out of the country, how much of its current poverty is due to the kind of rapacious attitudes that foreign companies have within the country. So there's a great sense that Indonesia had to protect itself from this. And we can see how these first and second factors combine. On the one hand, this growing sense of expectation about Indonesia finally assuming its rightful role in the world, and on the other hand, nationalism. And I think it's nicely captured in the statement that the former Trade Minister, Gita Wirawan, said to a senior Australian diplomat. And with some pride, he said that Indonesia used to be a price taker, it is now a price setter. And this captures the self-perception. It's not just about the terms of trade, it's rather Indonesia not being pushed around by the outside world. A much more assertive Indonesia. The third factor lies with the particularities of the Jokowi government. And this is the least diplomatically competent government in the last 2 generations. Jokowi himself made little secret of his ignorance of foreign affairs, and unfortunately he's saddled with a foreign minister who is similarly underwhelming on the international stage. Jokowi has abandoned SBY's globe-trotting, internationally activist role. He doesn't really seek to be a statesman. Indeed, he doesn't have the personal wherewithal to play that role. His focus is firmly and avowedly on economic diplomacy. So, for example, Indonesia's ambassadors have been told they need to think more like merchants than diplomats. They've been told to spend much more time at trade fairs than they do in diplomatic meetings, and that their performance will be evaluated on the basis of the increase in exports, the increase of investment that they've been able to win for the countries in which they are based. And so looking at it from this point of view, we see Indonesia, which perhaps has the narrowest focus in its foreign policy under Jokowi of any government in Indonesia's history. But Jokowi also embodies this powerful sense of entitlement that many Indonesians in the political elite have. And we need only look at these very revealing anecdotes that he's told about his role at international fora, such as the G20 meeting in Brisbane last year. And he explained to the media that when he went to sit down at one of the formal dinners, he was ushered to the end of the table. And he said, I didn't want to sit there in this very earthy sort of tukang becak language of his, enggak mau saya, this very kind of basic way of saying things. So he wanted to sit in the middle of the table with Obama, President Xi from China, and with Putin, because he said Indonesia is a big nation, negara besar. It's one of his favourite terms. Indonesia is a negara besar, and it should be sitting in the centre of the table with the other leaders of negara besar. And so that's, in fact, where he sat himself. And I understand it caused quite a few ruffled feathers in diplomatic circles. But you see the sense of entitlement. Indonesia, a large country, about or in the top 10 of the world, if you believe some figures, this is where it should be. Now, actually, what he did with his seating himself in that position is another matter, but nonetheless, he wanted to assert Indonesia's appropriateness for that part of the table. We also know that he's put one of the few really able, internationally able people in his palace circle into securing him a speech to Congress. He wants to go to the United States in the middle of the year, and he desperately wants to give an address to Congress because he says that's what the leaders of negara besar, of big countries, do. And once again, I'm not quite sure what in fact he intends to say, but he believes this is Indonesia's right in the world. Jokowi himself is not much interested in Australia. He's far more interested in countries that have developed rapidly because he wants to learn from them. China, most of all. He has a far more favourable impression of China than he does Australia. Other countries such as Korea, Japan, Malaysia. He is very interested in those countries. He asks a lot of questions about them. As far as I can work out, he asks very few questions about Australia. I suspect he sees us as a declining economic and strategic power, particularly in comparison to Indonesia. I don't think there's necessarily any hostility on his behalf. He's just not very taken with us. He doesn't see there's much in it for him to know much about Australia. He's also very stubborn, and we see this on the executions issue. I think it's fairly clear now from information that we have from around the palace, from his inner circle, that he didn't really care at all about the international protests, and I shouldn't put that in the past tense. He does not care about protests in the future, even though some of his most trusted international advisors are very worried. He didn't even want to talk about those things with people. And in fact, I think that the stronger that the international protest became, the more obdurate he was that he had to hold his position, because to back down would be seen to buckle in the face of international pressure. So this is the kind of president that we're dealing with, not very well informed internationally, with a very narrow agenda, and also an inclination to see pressure applied to Indonesia as unwarranted influence and intervention on Indonesia's internal processes. And just to follow up on one thing, so Bill mentioned a number of things about mistakes that Australians made. I think the single biggest mistake that an Australian leader made in the executions issue was not Tony Abbott's tsunami aid remark, although I think that was a major mistake. It was Julie Bishop's remark that we will pay for the food and the living costs of those prisoners. And Jokowi took personal umbrage at this, as if the Australians felt that was what the matter could now be reduced to, that we're paying for the food bills for those prisoners. And that was a really good example of undiplomatic behaviour by our senior diplomat. And it will be lodged firmly in Jokowi's mind for a long time to come. He's a man who does remember things for a long time. So how does Australia respond? And here I'll gloss over some of this because Bill has spoken about it. Certainly with a calmer, more measured policy, I think we've seen the Abbott government change its tone from some of the more overblown comments. The Abbott government in the early months was consistently saying things about Indonesia that Indonesia never said about us. You know, our best friend in the neighbourhood, no person more important to us than the Indonesian president and the like. We never hear Indonesian leaders say those things about us. And what they did was feed the bombast in many senior political circles in Indonesia, feeding the hubris. It also fed the sense that Indonesia was far more important to Australia than Australia was to it. Also, aid has long been a diplomatic prop, and it's becoming dramatically less useful in that capacity. This is not an argument for cutting or stopping aid, but rather we cannot achieve a lot of our diplomatic goals, we cannot cover up a lot of our diplomatic mistakes by using aid, because particularly for the Jokowi government, it increasingly has a take it or leave it attitude. There are a lot of very good reasons why we should continue our aid program, and we help a great many Indonesians, and we also help to make Indonesia a better place. But repairing bilateral relationship through aid processes is going to be increasingly less effective. My suggestion is that we adopt both a pragmatic approach and a much more culturally intensive approach. And by that, what I mean is that Australian leaders who are dealing directly with Indonesian counterparts develop an interest in the country beyond the brief that's in front of them. It must be 15 or 20 years since we've had any ministers or a Prime Minister who's been interested in Indonesia itself, who reads a bit more about the country, who can engage in an Indonesian leadership counterpart in a way that's interested about the country's history, its political developments and the like. And that kind of engagement is something, we've had a very business-like approach, and on one level that works quite well, but there won't be warmth in the relationship unless we develop a keener interest in Indonesia amongst our political elite. We know it's happening down at school level, universities, cultural groups and the like, but it's what the leaders of the country, the most important people, are doing. So I think of Australia, if the relationship is to get back on the tracks, we have to help think about what kind of new direction the relationship will go in.
Well, this is very intimidating. I think I could name about 5 people in this audience who could all stand up and do this better than I. First of all, though, so this is not just an agree fest. I'll have to throw a few bombs at my fellow panellists and disagree, prove that I'm the journalist on the panel. It was a dark moment. It was a dark moment, Bill, and I think Australia was entitled to be angry. And Allan, I actually think that Australians don't do diplomacy that badly, as you put it. I actually think Australians, having watched it for many years, do their diplomacy a bit like Australian rules football. It can be extremely robust, but it does have moments of great subtlety and an ability to do teamwork. And if the idea that I'm going to throw out tonight is to have any chance at all, the big idea I'd like to give you tonight, then we are going to have to play very good Australian rules. So my piece tonight is entitled An Optimist's Creed for Indonesia and Australia. And it essentially builds on those 3 extremely good presentations you've just heard. As a born optimist, I stand with Benjamin Franklin in believing that beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. And further, I believe that champagne is proof that God has an elegant sense of humour. So there you have my conceptual framework for you tonight on Australia-Indonesia relations. That is optimism tempered by hangovers. Now, surely making Australia and Indonesia neighbours proves that God has a sense of humour. Yin and yang, chalk and cheese, the odd couple of Asia. This is a relationship that could indeed drive you to drink. And as SPY said when he was in Canberra in 2005, quote, Our relations are so complex and unique that it can be pulled in so many different directions, and it can go right as often as it can go wrong. And he was right. But that's where the optimist creed starts to come in, because often with Indonesia, we tend not to acknowledge the champagne moments when we get them. And I really wanted to build part of this tonight around one of the smartest people I know, a guy called Rod Lyon. I don't want you to be misled by Rod's Delphic smile. He's actually a very smart man. And Rod makes the point that we have been waiting a long time for Indonesia's dark moment, the Indonesia gone bad scenario. Indonesia always has this capacity, I think, to surprise us on the upside. And Rod's line, I think, is right. This is the toast, the pop the cork idea. Quote, "Today, Indonesia looks more like our strategic partner than it ever has before." And that's a big thought. And I'll come back to it later when I will talk about what it doesn't mean, what it doesn't cover. But nevertheless, as a thought, that today Indonesia looks more like our strategic partner than it ever has before. And for those of you in this room, many of you who know about this relationship, that's quite a thing to be able to say. And I think that the Defence White Paper in August, are we looking still for August, do you think, Peter? Yes, all right. Yeah, you've got a heads up there. In August, we'll say exactly that. Now, all sorts of amazing things can go wrong. Bill Farmer and Allan Behm can tell you all about that. The odd couple do slapstick and the odd couple do drama. But we should look, I think, sometimes at the good things that have happened. And we should actually take some comfort from the fact that we have just had a vintage decade. We have had probably the best Indonesian president we will ever have. We should perhaps for a moment think about what that's meant for us. We could ask questions about how well we built on that. But take one moment. Take the moment when Barack Obama comes to Canberra in November 2011 and announces that the US Marines are coming to Darwin. And then he and Julia Gillard fly to Darwin and do it all again. And the Indonesian response was classic initially. It was the sort of response that you would have got from, say, Suharto and Benny Madani. It was chilly on the sort of the Suharto sort of scale, and on the Benny Madani scale, it was bombastic and very nasty. And the Indonesian Foreign Minister, Martin Natalegawa, took the old playbook and basically ran the old playbook. That this was, his quote I think was that he was worried that this would bring tensions and mistrust, and that this would introduce, these American Marines would introduce a vicious cycle into the region. It was the classic Indonesian playbook, which is, of course, in this sort of event, to quietly pocket the strategic benefit of the US Marines, while at the same time playing the normal nationalist, ASEAN, non-aligned response. That was exactly what we would have expected from Jakarta. We didn't actually get that because SPY essentially slapped down his foreign minister and said, no, this is something that we can deal with. And the really interesting, I think, the Javanese blessing, the really interesting thing was that in July 2012, about 6 months later, what does SPY do? He gets on an aeroplane and he flies to Darwin and has 3 days in Darwin with Julia Gillard while the US Marines are still there on their first rotation training. As I say, Javanese blessing. We will not get, as you've just heard, we will not get a president who is as good to us as that. But we shouldn't, on the other hand, underestimate what we've been able to do. For instance, what we might still be able to build on the framework treaty, that the security treaty that SPY signed with Howard. That's something we can build on. It was a treaty strong enough so that, unlike what Keating did with Suharto, when things got really bad, it didn't get blown away. And so after the eavesdropping scandal, when we had to give something to promise that we wouldn't go eavesdropping on the Indonesian president and his wife anymore, we're able to build a cooperative addendum on the conduct of surveillance and intelligence into our framework treaty. So there are structures there. There are structures we can move and work on. I think you've heard a lot about the problems of what I'd call the reverse beer goggles, the fact that we actually don't the reverse beer goggles seem to work in both directions, and it makes it hazy and indistinct. We often don't get that clear view of Indonesia, and they certainly don't have that clear view of us. We tend to look further north, and they never look south. That old Jakarta joke, Australia, it's a bit like your appendix, you only ever think about it when it hurts. We need to obviously get past that problem, which I think John Garno wrote about recently, where he said that there's this strange effect that Australia and Indonesia too often fail to treat each other as serious nations. And it's a funny thing, but it's true. I take some comfort, though, from what the opinion poll that Lowy did after the execution. The Lowy poll, I thought, showed that a lot of Australians get some of this. That essentially the main takeout from that poll was the strong preference. They found nearly 60% of the people polled said their preference would have been for private diplomatic protest, quiet diplomacy. And on the pullback of Paul Brixton, only 42% agreed with the withdrawal of the ambassador. So I think Australians do get it. And I think that's a pretty good result, given the heat and the heartache, and I think properly the sense of frustration and anger. So, very quickly, some ideas. Let me very quickly quote the man who did as much over the decades to mould my thinking about Indonesia as anybody, as Jamie Mackey. Jamie always argued that tone matters. No shouting, no lectures, no domestic politics. I think we did all right. And the interesting thing this time was that the domestic politics was being played as much in Indonesia as it was here. But essentially, I think, by and large, the Australian polity got it reasonably right, and I think Australians got it too. And the other point that Jamie always said, remember, it is not a special relationship, okay? The differences are too great at too many levels. Mutual understanding is possible, saith the sage Mackey, but, quote, it's merely hopelessly difficult at times. So, yes to a pragmatic, strategic partnership, but no to a special relationship. Now, quickly, in my last 60 seconds, having said all that, now let me throw a big idea at you, which if I had told Jamie about it, I think Jamie's line would be, in that wonderful wry way he says things, he would have cocked his head and said, "Comrade, I don't know what you've been drinking, but I want to taste some of that nectar." Because the big idea, I think, that comes naturally out of a lot of the things that Bill said, and a lot of things that Allan Behm was talking about, and certainly the points that Greg was making, is that it is time for Australia to spend the next 10 years building towards the 50th anniversary of our dialogue partnership with ASEAN. It is time for Australia to start building towards this idea that we, Australia, should become part of ASEAN. And that if ASEAN is in the process of creating a community, social, political, strategic, and if with ASEAN, as often, you more often get the shadow than the substance, but sometimes it'll surprise you on the substance side, that is something that Australia needs to be part of. To be clear about this, I've been doing a lot of talking about this in Southeast Asia over the last year. I've been talking to a lot of people, and I'm going to write a whole series of pieces on this, on the strategist later this year. But what I'm talking about is Australia, over the next 10 years, thinking about getting observer status. We want, I think, and we and the New Zealanders, because of course if we want it, the New Zealanders will want it, we want observer status. We want what Papua New Guinea got in 1976 and East Timor got in 2002. We want what Papua New Guinea and East Timor got, observer status. So this is not about walking away from the alliance with the United States. Quite a few ASEAN countries can be US allies. This is not even about geography. We share a border with Indonesia, as do East Timor and Papua New Guinea. This is about attitude and understanding and belief. And there's still one country, I think, above all others, that has to be convinced about Australia becoming a member of ASEAN. And that country, and a lot of my ASEAN interlocutors, most of whom didn't think much of the idea when we started talking, but some of them who came around, all of my Indonesian and Singaporean and other interlocutors came back to the same point. There's one big country that we will have to convince above all others about this idea, and that is Australia. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming this evening. I'll be focusing a little bit more on another aspect of the bilateral relationship that some of the other speakers haven't this evening. We've talked a little bit about interests, we've talked a little about institutions, and now I would like to talk a little bit about identity. And what I'd like to talk about is the changing Indonesian perceptions of Australia and why that's particularly important in getting part of our relationship back on track. Go home, Aussie. We don't need your aid money. Stay out of our business. That was some of how Indonesians reacted to both the Australian government and the Australian public's cries for clemency for Andrew Chan and Muran Sukumaran. And the Indonesian media's search for sensationalist headlines, no different from what we do here, often highlighted the low points. Coins for Australia, in particular, had a lot of currency. But there were other voices too, those that were sympathetic to Australia's attempts to protect its citizens, and those who joined the chorus for compassion in the name of our common humanity. Listening to Indonesian news reports and articles about the executions was an opportunity to observe the breadth of sentiment, not only about the death penalty, but perceptions of Australia. The Chan Sukumaran episode didn't reveal anything surprising, particularly for those of us who work on Indonesia or who've lived there before. There were the same themes about bogans and barley and defensive statements about Australian interference in Indonesian sovereign affairs, born from a strident anti-colonial history. Some might say that the new president's more nationalistic posture is an explanation for the intensity of anti-Australian sentiment in this latest episode, and as a result, things might get worse. But we're yet to see the fallout over time of a seemingly more nationalistic Indonesia, although I agree with Greg, things could get worse. The degree and quality of anti-Australianism will depend on the circumstances, but as history has shown, it's part and parcel of our relationship. But that said, we should remember there is still a healthy dose of pro-Australian sentiment in Indonesia. There's the good and the bad. So let's look at some trends. According to the Lowy Institute's Indonesia poll in 2012, respondents rated the warmth of their feeling towards Australia at 62 degrees, up from 51 degrees in 2006. But that said, we're still behind Japan, Singapore, and the United States. Borrowing from the Lowy poll again, 70% of Indonesian respondents said that it was very important that Australia and Indonesia work together to develop a close relationship. And I'll have to say the Indonesian embassy here in Canberra has done its bit to support that sentiment. The day after the executions, Ambassador Najib Rupat-Kusuma released a statement via the embassy's Facebook page that began with these words. Number one, Indonesia understands the views expressed by the people and government of Australia on the law enforcement measures taken against the 2 Bali 9 drug smuggling ringleaders. And number two, the Indonesian people and government express our sympathies to the family and friends of the deceased. He goes on to underscore the importance of the relationship, but then also asks for the media's support in providing what he says is proportional and objective reporting. I'll have to say that a statement could apply equally both to the Indonesian and the Australian media, and I'll come back to the role of media shortly. The Lowy poll also tells us a few things about how we're perceived in Indonesia. While some Indonesians viewed our counter-terrorism cooperation with Indonesia important in helping contain the terrorist threat in the region, several respondents had a couple of negative things to say as well. There are a couple of archaic views expressed. For instance, support for statements that Indonesia is right to worry that Australia is seeking to separate the province of West Papua from Indonesia, and also that Australia's policies towards Indonesia and the region is shaped too heavily by its alliance with the United States. So while the views on West Papua dropped between 2006 and 2011, fewer people agreed with that statement, it was still odd to hear the Sultan of Yogyakarta last week come out and warn Indonesians that Australia is apparently still wanting independence of West Papua. Although his view may not be pervasive, I think it's important for us to remember that those views still remain. So what does this all mean? As I said earlier, the good news is that we know that there's a mix of pro- and anti-Australian voices on certain issues related to the bilateral relationship. That's just par for the course. But the fact that we get to hear those voices is really testament to the vibrant and open media that has been fostered under 17 years of democratisation. We also know that there's significant support for the relationship. The bad news is things seem to be moving slowly. Perceptions are moving slowly. And public opinion can come to bear in the ways in which government responds. If Jokowi is truly a domestically focused president, then how the Indonesian public reacts will matter. It's in our interests, particularly our strategic interests, for the overall perception of Australia and Indonesia to change, not just stagnate. It would be best that we continue to focus on this over the long term. While there is some damage control that we can do during a diplomatic downturn, by that stage it's a little bit too late. Emotions run high. During and after a crisis, of course, high-level political statements are important for getting official relations back on track, but positive perceptions will help the relationship grow and lessen the dip in each time. And for that to happen, as we've heard many, many times before, people-to-people relations matter, but they'll require slow and patient investment. On the people-to-people front, there are a number of targeted programs already running. Let me highlight one. There's a record number of Indonesian students who arrived in Darwin last month for a cattle industry exchange program. 20 young Indonesians had a few weeks of training at Charles Darwin University in Katherine, and then they spent 6 weeks working at a cattle station, living with a host family, for a truly cross-cultural experience. And in terms of being proactive about archaic views about Australia, about our interference in West Papua, there are a few things we can do. I'd like to highlight in 2013, I was very lucky to be part of the inaugural conference of Australia and Indonesia Youth, or COSINDI, and it brought together 20 young professionals and academics, 10 from Indonesia and 10 from Australia, and we sat down and we discussed everything from economics to politics to defence relations, education, culture, and of course the media. It's very nice to have these kinds of people-to-people relationships, but it doesn't mean much unless there's much follow-through. So as part of that initiative, we agreed that we would do things that would materially improve the relationship. And to that end, we agreed that we would write more in the media in each other's countries. We would each draw from our area of expertise and share our knowledge with each other's publics. And since then, since 2013, I'm proud to report that some of my alumni have written op-eds, articles, podcasts, videos. And hopefully, those form part of the rich tapestry of bilateral relations that we Australians and Indonesians weave together. And one final thought. We should foster Australian studies in Indonesian universities. That's hardly a new initiative, but in this particular forum, I would imagine there's a lot of support for that. Of course, we're having difficulty funding our own Asian studies faculties here, but it's worth investing in the two-way exchange of information and knowledge. And for that, looking out into the audience, I have to say, I can't wait for the day to guest lecture at such a course in Australian studies taught at an Indonesian university, perhaps taught by either Evan or Andy. And I look forward to looking out to a bright young faces of Indonesians at an Australian Studies course, perhaps in Yogyakarta. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Nat, and really good to end on something of a positive note now. Let's get straight into some discussion, colleagues, and thank you for being on time, and thank you for those very focused and interesting perspectives. I'd like to start by putting to the five of you a couple of questions before I throw to the audience. And the first one is really to go back to a comment that Bill made at the start of his presentation, which was to say, whatever we do, we need to pursue relations with Indonesia on the basis of our national interest. And I thought to myself as a strategist, well, I'm shortly going to hear what that national interest is, what that expression of national interest is. And actually it didn't come. I didn't hear any of our speakers really say to me in a way that I could perhaps plagiarise for the next Defence White Paper. What a concise expression of our national interest should be. So that's my first question to you. And Bill, maybe I'll start with you and we'll go in the same order for a few minutes each, please.
Yeah. Whatever our national interest is, it's not been changed by this set of issues over the last few months. I mean, we can go through those. Really, Indonesia with territorial integrity and one that is well disposed to Australia. I mean, that would be a fundamental interest of ours. If you had process of disintegration of Indonesia, we end up with a lot of rat bag states like East Timor, some of the South Pacific states, all of them separated from Indonesia in I'd imagine, an atmosphere of ill will, and all of them looking to Australia to bail them out of what would undoubtedly be terrifically sort of messy future. So that's I think one of our fundamental interests is a stable and entire Indonesia, and that certainly has not changed.
Thank you. Allan, let's go to you now.
Yes, I get with Bill. Stable and prosperous Indonesia is our core national interest in this relationship. Certainly prosperity is one of the key drivers of stability, and having put a bit of effort into looking at the security dimension of changes to climate as it affects Australia and Indonesia, I'd have to say that instability is the most obvious consequence of Indonesia's inability to deal with climate. And an unstable Indonesia is a dangerous one.
Allan, is it a national interest for Indonesia to pay more attention to Australia, or is that less significant?
I think that that's a consequence rather than a cause of things. They will pay more attention to us as we get more deeply engaged in working with them on their stability and their prosperity. So it's a consequence of having a good relationship. It's not an interest in my view.
Okay, thank you. Greg, what's your answer to the national interest exam question?
I suppose there's the obvious things about that are easily measurable, economics, defence ties, those sorts of things. But I think there's a broader array of national interests, and how you view those, or whether you define them as national interests, depends on a number of assumptions. So one of the things that several of us have talked about is cultural ties, but not necessarily at sort of the classic people-to-people lower level stuff, but leaders who actually know something of each other's countries and can engage in a much broader kind of conversation rather than just the business at hand. And a lot of that comes to the issue of whether Australia really is behaving as if it's part of the region or if it's a kind of an Anglo enclave. And if people see that as an important part, if they have that kind of Keating-esque agenda that Australia should behave as if it really does belong in the region, well, then that kind of engagement at a high level is something that we should undertake. And I would see that, personally, my view is that that is in our national interests. I don't think a lot of governments of either persuasion in Australia have regarded that as particularly a high priority.
Okay, thank you. Well, Graeme, Dobell, we're looking through a beer goggle darkly, to coin a phrase. What's your read on the national interest question?
Well, to take it, first of all, on the strategic interest point, I mean, I think I can't do any more than quote Paul Dibb, who happens to be here tonight, on the reality that Indonesia, of course, is...
We'll get here before Paul's.
Yes, yes.
Make sure it's accurate.
This is the archipelago from or through which any threat to Australia must come. As Coral Bell said, this was our existential moment that haunts us still. So at a straight strategic level, then that has always been an Australian interest. And Paul, over the years, has gone back and forth a bit about whether Indonesia can be our strategic shield or not. But essentially, I think we are probably heading towards the positive end of that idea, away from the arc of instability, towards the idea of a strategic shield. To put it more broadly, I think, the point about Indonesia is that Indonesia frames Australia's view of Southeast Asia in exactly the same way that our view of the South Pacific is framed by our understandings of Papua New Guinea. I mean, that's a sort of a basic starting point for the way Australia does its sums on the region. And my view is that, and I'll not give you the same rave I gave you a moment ago, is that we need to do more than just think about that need to put ballast in a bilateral relationship. We need to frame it as broadly as we can. And if, for argument's sake, one of our interests in the region is to push a view about the use of capital punishment, last week it seemed to be a national interest that we were very passionate about. I don't actually think it's going to be one that we're going to be banging on. But if, for argument's sake, that was one of the elements of the Australian identity that we wanted to push out into the region. We've got a lot of convincing to do, both within Indonesia and within ASEAN, and we need to think as broadly as we possibly can about our ASEAN relationship, which will feed back into our Indonesia relationship.
Thank you. Well, Natalie, I hope you really do get the chance for that lecture to be given at the university in Jogja at some stage. What do you think your paragraph on the national interest is going to say?
Peter, I'm not going to go for an interest, I'm going to go for a theme. My theme would be steadiness. If Indonesia is truly as big and as consequential as we think it's going to be, I think that many of the trajectories in the country ought to be reflected by a sense of steadiness, and that's in Australia's interest. Let me explain. For instance, we want Indonesia's military to modernise, but not too quickly. We want it to be steady. We don't want there to be further insecurity in the region. We want Indonesia to grow its ties with other major powers like China, Japan, and the United States, but not each one of those too quickly. We want Indonesia to continue to democratise, and we want that to be a consolidating and a meaningful process, so we want that to proceed steadily. We also want its economic growth to become very well consolidated as well, but if it's too quick, attracts investment too quickly, and if things crash, it very well may change the character of the country. We want its anti-corruption procedures to keep continuing, but we don't want a backlash against that. We want that to be steady. So I think in Australia's national interest, looking at the elements of Indonesia that matter to us, looking at the strategic balance that it may hold in the region and the relationship it may play if it's truly to become a fulcrum, or the global maritime fulcrum that Jakarta wants it to be, I think a theme of steadiness would serve Australia very well.
Really, Indonesia's success in some ways is Australia's success. There's few ways, it seems to me, we succeed if Indonesia fails, and that's perhaps something to think about. My next question is to, again, reflect on actually Bill's start in the answer there, which was something along the lines, Bill, you said, well, I know whatever our national interest is, it's the same now as it was before this particular crisis. And yet I heard some very interesting sort of variations on a theme from our speakers about how we need to have a different relationship than the one we thought we might have wanted to have before probably a period of maybe 2 or 3 years ago when we just got ourselves into a state of constant crisis management. So someone said, I'll see if I can find who I should attribute this to. Well, we're not really going to be able to develop a partnership. I think, Allan, that was you. There is no special relationship as such. And Allan, you also made an observation that we're really not going to be able to manage a transformational relationship with Indonesia because that hasn't been the style of Australian approaches. Greg, you said we're going to be on a different track. We need to rethink our strategy in order to deal with an Indonesia which is thinking differently about itself. So the question I want to put to you is, what is this track that we are trying to put the relationship on? If you went to the last Defence White Paper, the 2013 White Paper, it talked, for example, about the need to build a deep strategic relationship with Indonesia. So again, I'm looking for lines to plagiarise here as far as the next White Paper is concerned. Do we say the same thing, or are we now accepting that the right track for the bilateral relationship is going to be a different track to the strategic partnership we were talking about in 2013? And Bill, again, I'll start with you and we'll go through the panel.
Look, I'll just say something from the perspective of the embassy in Jakarta. I mean, it's an embassy that's grown very dramatically in a quite short period of time, certainly a 10-year span. And it's grown not because of the desire of the Australian government to make a fashion statement about how important our interests in Indonesia or our relations with Indonesia are, but it's grown as a result of individual decisions by ministers, departments, agencies that they need and want people in Jakarta to be furthering a particular interest. For example, 10 years ago, there was no one from our agriculture department in Jakarta. There was no one from our transport department in Jakarta. There may well be others. Certainly 10 years ago, the coppers in Jakarta were focusing on drugs and money laundering. and the great growth in the police presence there, of course, in the last 10 years has been in counter-terrorism. So, as I say, I think I'm inclined to look at that organic growth based on perceptions of Australian needs and interests as something that will build a relationship in the future. And I think that in a way is a more sure foundation than the fashion statement stuff, because the fashion statement stuff, we muck around with words, with special, strategic, partnership, blah, 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 but it's really subject to political whims and sort of changing the fashions. So I think yes, we have put much more ballast into the relationship. People of goodwill are certainly working at that. Look at the Defence Alumni Association, where they're developing that capacity to speak frankly about things that matter. I think we have that with the police. We have it in some arcane areas like cooperation on fisheries. I think that's all good stuff.
Thank you. Allan, Behm, you're a fashionable person. Strategic relationship or different track?
Yeah, I think one of the problems in talking about a strategic relationship with Indonesia is actually the problem of language. We are the most monolingual country in the world, probably. Very, very few Australians can speak a second language, and even fewer can speak Bahasa. And if you can't approach a country through its own language, you can't understand it. It's just simply impossible to understand a country if you can't approach it through its language. And I think that for us, the greatest constraint on a long-term strategic relationship is our inability to get into the minds of our interlocutors so that we know that we are talking about the same thing. All of our interlocutors, all the ones I've dealt with for many years, they speak very good English. Indeed, many Indonesians speak better English than some Australians do. Take comfort. But when you start talking about things relating to, say, civil-military relations, we had a big seminar in Indonesia in 1999 to deal with that, or you're talking about what strategy actually means, and you talk about transparency and policy making, all of that means something quite different to very, very many Indonesians, our interlocutors, even though they're saying the same thing in English. And so I think that you can't really develop a strategic relationship with plenty of ballast and texture in it if you are incapable of talking about the same things. And that's why I think that the relationship will struggle ever to be a special relationship, but it can be quite a good and effective working relationship, I think. But
much more modest,
but constrained.
Much more modest objective.
Yes, I don't think we can't afford to be over-ambitious because we simply can't deliver it.
Yes. Well, Greg, you were arguing for the different track. Can you add anything to your comments?
Well, I suppose that it's, and I mentioned that I thought that it's how Australia responds to Indonesia's changed circumstances, and I think one thing that has to happen is that we readjust our expectations or our views on our relative importance to Indonesia, because I think many people have a default setting that Australia is a very important country to Indonesia. And if you look at a lot of things that are said about aid, they come with a connotation that Indonesia needs our help, that Australia is a much wealthier country and Indonesia has all these social problems and the like, and so these are the kinds of things that Australia has to help Indonesia with. And some of that goes back to the economic crisis of the late 1990s in Indonesia. Some of it goes back a lot further than that. That's not necessarily what the aid professionals say, but that's nonetheless, I think, quite a popular view in the population and also in political circles. But that's not really going to be a very realistic view in the next few decades, when Indonesia is going to quite overshadow us in economic terms. I'm not sure about, you mentioned the Defence White Paper, and it refers to Indonesia as a middle power. I don't think Indonesia is anywhere near being a middle power if you have a look at their military capacity. And I think the assumption that Indonesia being a top 10 nation will automatically mean, economically will mean it strategically in that level, I think is also very hazardous. So I think one of the things Australia has to acknowledge is that Indonesia is going to be much bigger than us economically, and they're going to pay much less attention to us, and they're going to feel as if they can punish Australia if we do things that they don't particularly like. And you only need to look at the levels of frustration that were despair almost within the Abbott government, within officialdom and broad society over the failure of the Jokowi government to respond to all the entreaties over the execution issue. Almost as if our aid should have brought us much more influence than what it has. And if you think of it from another way, as an Indonesian might think of it, well, these people have gone through what they see as due legal process, and why should Australia, the fact that they've been very generous with their aid, why should that give them any particular special voice on those kinds of issues? So that's a kind of, I think, reorientation of our views that we have to have, and not to think of Australia as as a much more influential country than what Indonesia is, and proceed from there.
Okay. Well, Graeme, Dobell, we're going to have a champagne relationship if Indonesia will let us join ASEAN, won't we?
Yeah. I hope that the people around Abbott and Julie Bishop weren't surprised by that. I mean, that would be yet more proof that that Canberra's memories in Canberra are shrinking. I mean, it's not so long ago that Megawati wasn't taking phone calls from John Howard. I mean, it's not the first time that they wouldn't take a call from us. Being the born optimist I am, I come back to that point, the pivot sentence, that today Indonesia looks more like our strategic partner than it ever has before. It's not saying that it is a strategic partner. It's saying it's looking a lot more like it than it has before. I think it's got a long way to go before it can be a full strategic partner. So, I mean, I'd be leading that in the white paper as an aspiration rather than a description of something that we've actually got. The other thing about strategic partner is that it's language that Indonesia is relatively comfortable with. They're happy with that as language. So let's keep riding it as hard as we can. And let's then see whether we can build in some other bits that certainly aren't there on the strategic partnership, like, steady or established or even reliable, which they certainly are not as strategic partners. But again, I come back. The Lombok Treaty is a very, very useful broad framework with some very nice language about how important Indonesia is to us, all of that sort of stuff. We've got a lot of frameworks there we can work. And then, of course, you put it into things like the ASEAN Defence Minister process, the EAS. I mean, there's a lot of bits of it that we've got in place as Natalie says, steady. But the strategic partnership thing is one we can be building for a long, long time.
I don't think Rod's here this evening. I'd like to hear him expand a little on that line, because it feels a bit to me like the relationship that we think we should have with India. I mean, we think we share a set of strategic perceptions, or should share a set of strategic perceptions with India, and yet we very clearly don't. But Rod's not here to defend himself, so I won't pursue that line. Nat, to you, do you think our respective medias will ever let us have a different style of relationship?
I think the paradigm for the relationships should still be the good neighbour relationship. That should be the overall framework. And then within that, as Graeme has said, the strategic partnership should be an aspiration. But I don't necessarily think that language and culture are going to be the immediate bar. There are countries in the world that have very deep and special strategic partnerships that don't share any kind of language bar, but it's born through a sense of habit, through norm, and through history. So if we keep that as an aspiration and we keep that consistent through our white papers, hopefully it's a process that it's not going to be dictated by white paper to white paper, but something that we hold constant throughout as an aspiration to keep building, because I think Australia and Indonesia do have shared strategic interests, and how we choose to address them together. If Indonesia is going to be much more important than Australia, then it's imperative for Australia to really latch on to strengthening that strategic partnership as much as possible.
Thanks, Nat.
Thank you very much. Christian Supriyanto from ANU. Looking at the problem of trust, and many people think that Australia-Indonesia suffers from trust deficit. I have a problem in understanding the term trust deficit because Indonesia also, arguably shares some kind of trust issues with other countries as well, with China, with the United States, and during the Cold War, to some extent, with India. So what makes trust, the issue of trust with Australia, so distinct from Indonesian trust issues with other countries? And coming back to Greg's presentation about that Jokowi administration has, to my impression, has some kind of a siege mentality by Western intervention. To what extent can Australia go to reassure Indonesia that it is a trustworthy partner relative to, say, China, for example?
I might direct that
Thank
to you, Greg. You had the comment about trust, I think, didn't you? So,
No,
or was it
I
Allan?
did.
Sorry.
It was Allan.
Allan.
I'll take responsibility for that.
Yep.
Trust is it's quite a complex concept, trust. In fact, I was talking to Patrick Walters about this just today, because in preparing my notes, I had a look at Francis Fukuyama's really remarkable book called Trust, where trust is the critical underpinning, in Frank's view, of how the economy actually grows and works. So I'm not talking about trust simply as a value that exists between human beings. I'm talking about trust as a dynamic between societies. So it's a little bit more elusive. It's my strong view that trust is actually generated by the strength of the institutions in a society. And I think one of the reasons that there is not as much trust, I'm not saying that there's necessarily mass distrust, but it's sort of like being a civilian in the defence organisation. Your military colleagues don't distrust you, they simply don't trust you. And I say that with my friend Peter Nicholson in the room, because we do trust each other because it takes a long time to develop it.
Maybe it was just you, Allan.
Could have been, but I'm making a more fundamental point here.
It was just that bow tie.
It's something that you build, and it's built, I think, through the institutions, so that for Australia and Indonesia to generate trust between themselves, we need to work to make sure that our institutions are mutually transparent. That's my view.
Greg, did you want to add?
Well, particularly in response to the notion of the siege mentality, and I wouldn't just confine this to the Jokowi government. I think it's across much of the political elite now, and it's been building for the last few years, and it has deep historical roots. It goes back to Indonesia's experience of colonial times and particularly rapacious Dutch colonial power, and so. It's never, and so this perception of how the world is perpetuated to every generation in the school books that are studied and the like. So I think it's deeply embedded in the Indonesian national psyche. And one of my colleagues at ANU, Hal Hill, talks about good times leading to bad policy in Indonesia. And one of the things that happens at the moment where Indonesia is doing very well economically is that policymakers feel that they can then indulge themselves in policy terms, and a lot of the policies that they bring into or proclaim are policies that in actual fact are very almost autarchical, sort of protectionist policies. So we see a very wide range of restrictions that have been imposed on all sorts of imports, and some of them, frankly, ridiculous, banning the import of offal and second-hand clothing and a whole lot of other things, with restrictions on mobile phones. And this coming at the same time when Jokowi has a very active international campaign to try and attract investment. And it seems to me is if in his mind there is not necessarily a contradiction between the two, but in reality for people who are wanting to do business in Indonesia, there is a very real contradiction. And so this is one of the problems. So there's this kind of bipolarity. And so you ask, what can Australia do? And I suppose one thing would be not to have too many issues like Bill mentioned with the cattle importation issue, which people didn't just see as a really stupid thing that an Australian government did, but as something that was a plot to drive up meat prices during approaching Ramadan and things like that. It easily took on conspiratorial tones. And so those things can have a long-term impact for us. And I think what Australia can do is not only avoid those things, but constantly emphasise the need for Indonesia to be engaged globally in the world, to be reasonably open, and perhaps to discourage some of that really antipathetic discourse about neo-liberalism, capitalism and the like. I think that's a very popular discourse in Indonesia, but in actual fact it's quite counterproductive for what Jokowi and what Indonesia wants to do. 7 or 8% growth rates, you cannot have all the policies that go with that anti-neoliberal agenda. And so that's why people have to decide, am I doing the things I really love talking about, or am I doing things that are really good for the country?
Thanks, Greg. I think it turns out also that bad times can lead to bad policy as well. Now, there was one question here.
My name is Elizabeth Talbot. I'm with the Department of Defence. I'd just like to know what you think the executions of Chan and Sukumaran will mean in, say, 10 years' time. Will it have fallen off the radar, or will it have left a scar?
Barlow and Chambers.
Yes, exactly.
Of course it'll have fallen off the radar. People will, yes, not only 10 years' time, much before that. I mean, there may be some residual thing, if residual result in the form of this greater expression in Indonesia of a sentiment hostile to capital punishment. So there may be something that will come of that. But as a bilateral relationship, I mean, it's already gone. The two have been killed. You can't kill them anymore. I just think we should just forget it, move away from it, and declare it a draw and test.
Okay. Couple of points. I covered Barlow and Chambers. One almost offline. Barlow and Chambers, 2 Anglo-Saxon names. Sukumaran and Chan, no, a different Australia, different Australian identities. Will it fall off the radar at a diplomatic level? Yes, it will. But will it fall off the radar in broadest terms? I hope not. I hope that Australia does what one of the great adoptees of Australia, a very fine Asian gentleman who took Australian citizenship, used to argue, which was that the thing that actually really matters about Australia and Asia are the things that are different. The things that matter about Australia for Asia are things like an Australian perspective on the way politics gets done, or rule of law, or human rights. And that Wang Gungwu used to say that if Australia really is going to matter in Asia, it's going to be because we are the odd man in, that we're going to go and talk about things that don't necessarily get talked about by some of the other players. And that's valuable. And we actually get a bit of respect for that when we play that game. So I hope it doesn't get forgotten. I hope that it is part of Australia's discussion of what a good society looks like and what good societies think about. And the funny thing is, of course, that on capital punishment, governments in Asia quietly are doing what governments in Asia always do, which is that they are slowly changing position while not admitting they're changing position. Singapore is a classic example. The moment
would never happen in Canberra.
Right? Well, I know. Hey. But Singapore, the moment Lee Kuan Yew left, cabinet finally was no longer minister mentor. Within 12 months, Singapore had very quietly changed its laws, giving its judges a lot more latitude, moving back from the mandatory death sentence stuff. They'd actually decided that having the reputation as the only shopping centre in the world with capital punishment was actually not a good international branding look. And some of the other Asian governments are having slowly some of the same discussions, which even the United States is starting to think about. God help us all. So no, I hope it's not forgotten. I really do. And it isn't going to be the top of the briefing paper. But in terms of the discussions which we try to have about human rights and the way we think good government operates, and all those other discussions which those strange Australians insist on having, I think that's a useful thing for us to do.
Just a couple of quick observations, if I might, Peter. There's two very important geopolitical issues here, well within the time frame of the white paper. If by 2030 Indonesia has 300 million people and is the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world, it's clearly going to become more important as a geopolitical shield to our northern approaches, to use the old language. Equally, Bill, obviously you're right when you say we don't want, my words, a Yugoslavian split up of Indonesia. Can I put it to you, as unlikely as it is, but as a defence planner I would need to think about this, Allan Behm, what is the percentage chance of the democratic experiment failing and an extreme nationalist, maybe authoritarian Indonesia rising? Because that would focus our minds like nothing else. We could forget the Middle East. The second quick geopolitical point is the way China is starting to bully Southeast Asia. You know, their former foreign minister saying to the ASEAN countries in their presence, China is a large country, you are small countries, that is a fact. What I'm seeing in the ARF meetings I go to in the last 9 years is the Southeast Asian countries are getting fed up with that. They're not going to go a long way quickly, but I'm seeing the Indonesian representative, former Ambassador Wiryono, trying to give some leadership. And what we want is an ASEAN with a strong natural leader, being Indonesia, to offset China not having a sphere of influence, to use an old-fashioned expression, in Southeast Asia.
Well, thanks. You take the microphone here too, Bob.
Just one observation, and that is I don't believe that we should get too wrapped about culture. We've had some fairly uncultured, in Indonesian terms, foreign ministers in Indonesia, like Mokhtar Kusumat Maja for one, who you'll remember, and some ambassadors in Australia of like mind. So I don't think we need to do that, get too worried about that. And the other thing is, of course, the best book ever written on Indonesian foreign policy is written by a guy who probably spoke no more than 10 words of Indonesian. So I don't think we need to follow that. But some specific questions. First of all, what does the panel think that Indonesia's opening up of Papua to foreign journalists is going to have on the relationship between the two countries? Because there's bound to be some pretty sharp commentary coming out as a result of that. And the second question to the panel is, will Australia become a, sorry, what do you call it, Graeme? Observer member in ASEAN before the biggest country in Southeast Asia becomes an observer member.
Okay, so we have Indonesia, China, and we have Papua, which I think is a good thing to perhaps pick on as well. I'm going to go in opposite order this time, so Nat, get ready.
Sure.
And maybe you could talk about the Papua and the journalist question.
I actually wanted to talk about Paul's question
Please.
About China and Southeast Asia. I just wanted to make one observation, is that under Jokowi's current foreign policy, there are statements emanating that suggest that ASEAN is no longer the cornerstone of Indonesia's foreign policy, but a cornerstone. And that's a particularly important distinction. And the question then remains, well, what's Indonesia really going to do about ASEAN? If it chooses to go down the ASEAN route, it really needs to resource its secretariat in Jakarta far more than it does currently. Per capita of diplomats there doing far more of the heavy lifting than they actually should. But I think that's probably something for us to think about, because if from Australia's perspective, we would like ASEAN to be a bit more of the framework of Indonesia's outlook towards China and its behaviour in land reclamation, we may have to ask ourselves, what role are we going to play? So it's just one thing I'd like to highlight.
Thanks, Nat. Let's go to Graeme then.
Yeah, Papua. Very interesting that Prime Minister O'Neill in Papua New Guinea is opening up Papua, West Papua, in ways that I think most Australian diplomats would have hoped Papua New Guinea would never do. We Australians have been extremely comfortable with Papua New Guinea's see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil about what's happening on the other side of the border. It's worked extremely well for us. It's worked pretty well for Papua New Guinea, and it's worked extremely well for Indonesia. Now, if O'Neill, for whatever reason, decides that the Melanesian Spearhead Group is going to admit representatives from Papua freedom movements, and the Melanesian Spearhead Group is going to start using that as one of their issues for the way they deal with Indonesia, that is an extremely different Papua New Guinea approach to the...
Sorry, Graeme, I was just meaning Indonesia has just opened their part of Papua too.
Yeah, I understand that, and I'm coming to that. I've always said about Irian Jaya Papua that the real problem for Indonesia is the day that the independence movement gets 100 mini-cams and distributes them and gives every independence fighter CNN's or Al Jazeera's post office box number when the pictures start coming out. Okay? It served Indonesia well that it has been effectively a closed province. And when I was going into East Timor when East Timor officially ceased being a closed province, and that changed the way the debate ran. So Papua as an open province, I don't see how Indonesia can keep it a closed province, but Papua as an open province opens up avenues for Papuans, and I don't think that transmigrasi has worked. I mean, the divisions between Indonesians and Papuans are never going to be solved. So as a policy headache for Indonesia, as a policy headache for Canberra, and as an incredible policy headache for Papua New Guinea, I think there are a lot of downsides still to come, and I really am amazed that O'Neill thinks that this is a good idea. That he gives anything to the Papuan brothers that will then come back to haunt him. That's probably a pretty hard-edged realist view of it, but I think that there's a lot of downside to all of that.
Graeme, thank you. Greg, last thoughts from you?
Just a very brief response on Paul. I don't think there's much prospect of Indonesia descending or reverting to authoritarianism. Public opinion polling consistently shows very high levels of support for democracy, well into the 70% range. For all the problems that Jokowi has and the like, they are, I think, that's the kind of tumult that Indonesian democracy should be able to deal with. We get some regression, but it's not a reversion, I think, to another system. And I also don't think that there's any great risk of Indonesia balkanising or any kind of Yugoslavia scenarios. In a way, Indonesia is more united now ironically with devolution than what it has been for any time going back 30, 40 years, I suppose. So those are not the things that worry me about Indonesia.
Allan, you're the penultimate word.
Yes, I'm a bit with Paul, though, I might say. You must always maintain a strategic calculus about the things that really do matter to you. And certainly were Indonesia to revert to an aggressive authoritarianism, that would be a very, very serious strategic problem for Australia. And so we have to think all the time about what are the best techniques available to us to avoid that from happening, to mitigate the effects that are always within Indonesian society, where there can be breakups. I'm pretty optimistic about Indonesia, but I nonetheless do entertain that very, very fundamental concern about the forces that divide it. One thing I will say is that any country that has a motto like Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, or a pluribus unum, if I might refer to another big country, has got deep problems. Whenever you've got to advertise it, we are going to be one out of many, or divided we are one, which sort of they mean the same thing. They're making a very frank admission of some quite fundamental tensions within their society.
Australia,
so many of you would not have seen the commonality between Indonesia and the United States, but there it is for you, just their motto. And I come back to the view that whether it's managing the defence relationship, which is the bit of the bilateral relationship that I do know very well, or whether it is in the other fields of endeavour in the bilateral relationship. I spent a number of years in the Attorney General's portfolio where we did some quite interesting things with Indonesian judges and Indonesian courts. That institution building, and I sound like a broken record, I'm sorry about that, but institution building is actually one of the things that's most strongly in our interests. Because the stronger Indonesians' domestic institutions, including the media institutions, their political institutions, I would love to see the Speaker of the House of Representatives, well, I'd like to see him migrate permanently to Jakarta, but...
we are looking for solutions here.
Presuming that they don't need the hairstyle yet. The point I'm making, though, is that the symbolic has a lot of power in Indonesia. And so to build bridges between our parliamentary institutions, in my opinion, is a very, very important thing to do, and we don't pay nearly enough attention to that. Similarly, the good work that's going on between our universities in Australia and in Indonesia, that needs to be strengthened too, because I think that the construction of the bilateral knowledge base is one of the best ways of ensuring that we don't fall down the hole of a militaristic Indonesia. And the focus that we've had for a long time in our bilateral defence relationship is absolutely about that, as Paul and I both know very well. We did get away in 1999 with a most extraordinary bilateral meeting in Jakarta, where we spent 3 days talking about civil-military relations. And there are at least a couple of us in the room who saw Bambang Yudhoyono stand up at the end of this dialogue and for 45 minutes wave the finger at his senior 2-star, 3-star and the other one 4-star officer, saying that a bit like David Morrison on gender issues. If you do not like this, get out. And that's what he said in very, very clear terms. Now, we created that opportunity, and it's that kind of opportunity that if we can continue to do that, then we mitigate the possibility of that kind of breakdown in Indonesian civil society.
That leadership is why he's such a good president.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Peter was there. Peter can vouch for the fact that I'm not making up Bambang Yudhoyono's 45 minutes of a lecture, the like of which none of us would ever have experienced in our own society or our own country. Very powerful moment.
Send Brahman Bishop to Jakarta, right? Oh, which reminds me that Suharto asked Keating about the Australian question time. So Keating sent Suharto edited highlights of question time, and as I understand it, Suharto was so taken that he got the cabinet all around. Say, look at what these bullets get up to.
I think in some ways the current speaker was probably more attuned to Suharto's day than... Bill, you have the last quick word.
Just a few things. I certainly agree with Greg that I don't see any sort of chance of sort of full-scale reversion. But there are certainly sort of elements in the mixture that lead me to think that nothing is guaranteed. I mean, we had Prabowo sort of saying that the electoral system should go backwards, certainly through our lens, should go backwards in ways which were much more new order than where we are now. And you've certainly got very strong interests in powerful elements of Indonesian society which are strongly opposed to the KPK and the anti-corruption movement. And I think in a quite benign way, former Vice President Budiono, when he was the coordinating minister, he gave a lecture at Gadjah Mada University where he said, democracy in Indonesia is not assured until Indonesia becomes a middle-income country. And he really, I think it was in 2007, and it was an economist's analysis. And he said, because no other country is a democracy which is not a middle-income country. That's a quite interesting argument that he made as a coordinating minister of the government. So I think there are some elements there that where people are certainly hankering after a different order, a different way of doing things, and some of that is harking back to darker times. So I think it's very important that we continue to ask exactly that sort of question, while at the same time doing everything we possibly can to help move things in the right direction through promoting prosperity, institutional strengthening, and the right way of doing things in an emerging democracy as Indonesia is.
Well, Bill, thank you. This has been a truly fascinating discussion. I did allow it, because it was so interesting, I did allow it to extend 10 minutes or so, but I'm now going to bring the meeting to a close. I would observe to all of you that your presentations will make wonderful contributions to the ASPI Strategist blog site, and please don't consider yourself off the hook until you've actually provided those to us. I like to hand out an award at these events for the most alarmingly unexpected use of a metaphor or symbol, and Graeme had actually aced that, I thought, right up until the very end with his use of the two-way beer goggle metaphor, which I think is one that really should be used more often. But Allan's alarming idea of a unexpected diplomatic envoy, I think, probably has to take my award, and in some ways I see the plot of, I think it's Aliens 2 somehow playing out in the background. Look, it's really been a fascinating discussion. Can you please thank our speakers this evening? And thanks as always for coming. I look forward to seeing you again.